first, selection and speciation. So before we talk about how species adapt, we need to talk about how we actually track all of this information about species and populations as biologists. Biometry is the use of mathematics and statistical methods for analysis of biological systems, like, for example, population genetics. And this is how we get a lot of our information about the genetics and like species. And this is how a lot of these trees and everything is determined based on a series of mathematical and statistical models, methods, and analyses. However, biometry is used for a lot more than just population genetics. It's also very useful for medicine. It's very important to determine the effects of medication and therapies on targeting individuals. So all of this studies for new drugs, new therapies, new treatment methods, all of that uses a lot of statistics and mathematics to determine is it better than what we currently have? Is it statistically significant, and all of that, right? You don't really have to know too much about the actual statistical methods. You should know a little bit of like what is statistical significance and what is not. But generally, it's not, you don't have to know too deep, but you do have to know this is how we get a lot of our population genetic information. This is what we use for medicine and medical trials, clinical trials. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's actually talk about the genetics. So differential reproduction is very important, and it's the idea that certain groups of population leave behind varying numbers of offspring as opposed to each other. Essentially, in simplified terms, this means certain individuals in a group reproduce more than others. Some people have more kids than others in a population of animals, or actually any kind of organisms. This can apply to any type of organism. We track this, again, using statistical methods of biometry we mentioned, and we determine which groups statistically reproduce more often, what the common factor leading to that is, and we try and figure out why is this particular group of people reproducing more often than their peers. And generally, the ones that reproduce more often are determined based on some kind of physical trait that they have, which is very often linked to a genetic gene. And that physical trait is deemed more fit or more well suited to survival. Again, it can be that for evolution and adaptation, we consider it what is more fit and more well suited to survival. But as for differential reproduction itself, it's more about what is deemed more fit, right? That'll typically get more mates. The person who is deemed more fit will get more mates and reproduce more often. However, there is also an aspect of which is actually more fit, because we're also tracking which ones have more surviving offspring, and generally the ones that are more fit first live long enough to reproduce themselves, because you can't reproduce as soon as you're born. You have to actually make it to maturity, and then their offspring also have to make it to maturity, and they have to actually survive long enough to be considered viable offspring. Okay. Next, let's talk about selection. So since one group of a population is reproducing more often than the others over a very long period of time, or more accurately, we're talking about animals generally, it's a long period of time. More accurately, it's after many, many generations of that animal or organism's life cycle. For example, if we're talking about humans, it's generally a very, very long time, because we live for a very long time. We have a very long lifespan. It takes long for us to actually get to maturity and have children of our own or not have offspring. So it's generally a very long time for selection to occur. It takes many centuries. Whereas for something, and this is one of the reasons why we use so commonly fruit flies for genetic experiments, that for them, actually many generations could happen in months. In months, you could observe a significant difference, because their life cycle is like weeks. So they reproduce very, very, very quickly, and you can go through many, many generations very, very quickly by our standards. So you could see the effects of selection relatively shortly. Okay. So over a long period of time, the majority of the population will be descendants of that one group. And so we'll most likely have similar genetics to those founders, at least in the trait that was selected for. And when we talk about selection, we're usually talking about in a trait or traits that are selected for. So yes, all of the genetics of that original founding group will be passed on to their offspring. But if that trait that they have, for example, like blonde hair, is not something that's selected for, all of the descendants after many generations may not have blonde hair, even though they were descended from that original founder group. And that's due to this third paragraph right here. Some of the offspring of that founder generation, they will not have inherited the selected trait, or they might not have inherited the selected trait. These members of the second gen will typically not reproduce as well as their siblings and cousins, which did inherit the trait. And so they will usually die off and not have offspring. And this will repeat every generation, so that some of the offspring which don't inherit the trait will simply not reproduce as well, or will die off, and they will not. And after many generations, it'll kind of like dilute itself out. So if, for example, again, let's go with blonde, I'll put in red, blonde versus brown is little b, and then is not the selected trait. And we have, we'll just say fit and not fit physically is small f. Over time, this person will have many offspring, whatever. And some of them may have something like this, where they have blonde hair and they're fit, and they're just like their father or whoever this is, who is also big B, big blonde and fit. And many of them will be like that. They'll be blonde, fit. But for example, one person will be brown haired but fit, and another person will be blonde, but they will not be fit. They'll have a little f. Right. So this person will have offspring. This person will have offspring. This person, because they are fit, will also have offspring. This person will not, he'll die. And now we have a new generation. Again, we'll blonde and fit, etc., etc. This one will have offspring. They'll be mostly brown-haired, fit. Brown-haired and fit. And so you can see if you just continue down like the same line, if you have any little f's, they'll potentially die off. If you have any little b's, which is brown hair, they won't die off because that's not the trait that's being selected for. So they'll usually continue and have more brown-haired kids, and eventually the population will be more or less have a ratio of blonde to brown hair. All right, this is a very simplified diagram, but this is just so you get the idea. Whereas the majority will have this big F, because if they don't, they'll die off, and after multiple generations of selection and kind of like a filtering process, most of the little s will die off, and you'll be left with almost all big Fs. Okay. And that's why certain traits are selected for, whereas others are not. And that's why after many generations, the entire population is not just a clone of the founding generation. They have slight differences because those differences were not selected for. Okay. And again, this is called selection. The gene responsible for the desired trait was selected for, and so it became more widespread among the population after many generations. That's the whole idea. Okay. What are the results of selection? So the main result of different selection among different populations over time is called speciation. For example, if there are two populations of the same species of jaguars in two different environments, and each population selects for different traits based on their environment. So say one trait select for white fur because they live in the snow, whereas another trait is for, I don't know, like yellow fur because they live in the sand and all the grass is yellow or something like that. Over time, over many generations, the one that's living in the Arctic will develop white fur, whereas the one that's living in the savanna will develop yellow fur. And they'll select for that over time, and any like white fur that are born into the savanna will die off. Any yellow fur that are born into the tundra will die off, and only the white will survive, versus all of the yellow fur will survive. And then over many generations, populations may be so different from one another that they are actually considered different species. Again, just fur color usually is not enough, but there's many other factors. Like for example, if the Arctic, they have to develop different types of teeth because they have they're hunting like small game, versus in the savanna, they're hunting big game, so they have to develop a different type of teeth or a different type of legs for running. instead of rather than like, I don't know, like jumping and crouching in the Arctic or something like that. These are just examples, but something like that. Develop different teeth, different legs, different fur color, different eyes, a lot of different factors. And eventually over time, they'll be so different that they're actually not even considered the same species anymore. And this speciation is the very basis of the phylogenetic tree, which we talked about in the population genetics lecture earlier on. I want to give like an example of the human phylogenetic tree. So this is kind of like what our, and remember, look, when I was talking about how long it takes, this could take like millions of years, right? Since we had these ancestors, this could happen over millions of years. This is not something that happens like over one generation, over 100 or even 1,000 years. Okay, and so here we are, Homo sapiens, right? And we're on this branch of the phylogenetic tree. At some point, like right here, which is about 1 million years ago, there was one type of ancestor that we had. It doesn't have a name here, but we'll say this is our HA, our Homo ancestor, I guess. And eventually, we had Homo sapiens living in, we had two groups of these HAs. One was living in, say, one part of Africa, and another was living in, say, another part of Africa, Europe or Asia, it doesn't matter, regardless. And over time, these two groups of HAs had to each had to adapt to their environment, and they underwent selection for different traits based on their environment, based on what animals or food was around them, based on everything like that. And eventually, these two groups of HA became so different from each other that they grew so different traits. One of them became known as Homo sapiens, and the other became known as Homo neanderthalis, or Neanderthals, we call them in simple terms. So humans and Neanderthals. And these two groups existed separately, but at the same time, at least for a period. And they are considered different species. We are considered different species than Neanderthals because we were considered different enough. And so that's why they're a different branch on the phylogenetic tree, right? And so right here is the speciation event. Actually, we'll change the color to purple. Right here in purple is the speciation event. It's the branch where the HA, the original ancestor, became so different between the two groups that they actually became classified as different species. This is kind of like a gradual process. So it's not like they birthed somebody and they were like, oh, this person is completely different than us, so this must be a Neanderthal. It's no longer an HA. Now this is a Neanderthal. And a person was birthed now, okay, this is a Homo sapien. This is not HA anymore. But it's kind of like more gradual, where they had little changes, little changes, little changes, little changes, little changes, little changes. And then when you look back after all those little changes at the generation, and you look like 10 generations back, and you're like, these are completely different. So it's no longer an HA, it's now a Neanderthal. Okay, it's more like that. Okay, so that's just an example with something that we're all familiar with, which is the humans. And you can see this happened multiple times. So again, before you had HA, you had this, I'll call it HAA for the ancestor's ancestor. And they developed into the HA, but they also developed into the erectus. And before that, we had this, and like all of these different branches. Okay. Next, let's talk about polymorphism, which is the kind of alternative to speciation. Speciation does not account for all differences between populations. There are some differences between populations that are still considered to be the same species, for example, and this is called usually polymorphism. Polymorphism is important because it breaks populations into distinct classes or groups, which have a specific difference. But this difference is obviously not one enough to be considered another species, but it's still a difference nonetheless. And kind of like the important thing about polymorphism is that it's usually, when we call polymorphism, it's usually referred to distinct classes rather than scale. For example, height is not really considered polymorphism because it's more like a scale, whereas something that is considered polymorphism is sex among animals. Most animals are either male or female, with very specific and perceptible differences in their traits and genetics. So, for example, you can clearly see different chromosomes, different reproductive organs, and different things like that between most animals. They have different sexes. That's one polymorphism that we've developed. And again, not everything has polymorphism. For example, like plants don't really have that. Some of them are both male and female. And they kind of like reproduce with themselves between different parts of the plant. Bacteria definitely don't have sexes, right? Or viruses or other life forms. Other examples can include blood type in humans, right? Having A blood, B blood, AB blood, O positive, negative. Another example among animals is there are black versus yellow jaguars. They're still both jaguars and they can still mate with each other, but they are visibly different. One has black fur, one has yellow fur. Different patterns on butterfly wings. So even butterflies of the same species might have different patterns on their wings, depending on which area they're from. So differences like that. And this is how you can, this is kind of an example of like the jaguar that I was talking about. There's the yellow fur, black fur. You can see they're both the same species. They can both mate with each other. They look, other than the color of their fur, they look pretty much identical. But some have a light morph versus a dark morph.